Good afternoon, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I am Eowynne Noble, the Chief People Officer here at the firm. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge the land that we gather on. The First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples have been present in Canada for thousands of years. These Indigenous communities have a profound and ongoing connection to this territory. Their histories and their cultures continue to shape our shared future. At Fasken, we recognize that we have a role to play in the ongoing process of reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities here and across Canada. We know that this is not a one-time effort, it is a journey, and we have embarked on a reconciliation journey by adopting a plan with the purpose of contributing meaningfully to reconciliation. This commitment reflects our belief that reconciliation is about building relationships, listening deeply, and taking action that matters. As part of this listening, today we are here to honor the International Day of Persons with Disabilities. We are proud to host this fireside chat with Leanne Taylor, who you're going to hear from momentarily. I wanted to welcome Leanne, a Paralympian whose story is nothing short of extraordinary. Leanne was paralyzed from the waist down in 2018 after a bike accident. Fast forward 7 years, and Leanne has established herself as among the world's best Paralympic athletes, and she earned herself a bronze medal at the Paris 2024 Paralympic Games. Her journey is a testament to resilience, courage, and the power of determination. Beyond sport, and this was really impressive to me as well, Leanne is a leader in her professional life. She is a compliance officer in the pharmaceutical industry and has been recognized as one of the top 25 women in biotech. What makes her message so powerful is how it translates beyond sport. Her experiences remind us that inclusion is not just a value that we talk about, it's a practice we live every day. It's about creating spaces where every person can thrive, contribute, and lead. Our partnership with the Canadian Paralympic Committee reflects that same commitment. And together we are working to advance accessibility, equity, and opportunity, not only in sport, but in our firm. We know at Fasken that diversity and inclusion strengthens our profession and our ability to serve clients with integrity, insight, and with the top level of perspectives that they want. As you listen to Leanne today, I invite you to think about what her story means for us as leaders. How can we champion in ways that go beyond policy and make something part of our culture? How can we ensure that every voice is heard and every talent is recognized? So with that, I thank you for being part of this conversation, and I look forward to hearing more of your story, Leanne, as we continue today. Letecia, over to you.
Thank you so much, Eowynne. Before we begin, I'd love to share just a quick note, some housekeeping notes. Today's event features live French translation, so if you'd like to listen in French, please click En Français button at any time. And at the end of the event, we'd appreciate if you could take a moment and complete one of the surveys. Your feedback really does help us continue to improve these sessions. So, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce someone whose impact reaches far beyond the athletic arena. As Eowynne mentioned, after her accident, Leanne Taylor set herself a remarkable challenge to complete a triathlon, only using her arms just 8 months after her injury, a feat that required her to swim 750 meters, hand cycle 20 kilometers, and push a race wheelchair 5 kilometers. Super impressive. Her competitive spirit quickly propelled her to her national championships and a series of podium finishes. And in every race she entered during the 2024 season. Leanne became the first woman to represent Canada in wheelchair class triathlon at the Paralympic Games, and her medal marked a historic milestone for Canadian sport. Because of Leanne, Canada's first triathlon medal came from a wheelchair user at the Paralympics. Outside of competition, Leanne is a passionate advocate for disability communities, serving as a peer mentor for Spinal Cord Injury Manitoba, as well as a board member of the Manitoba Wheelchair Sport Association. In addition to empowering so many others to discover their own strength. And while she's been recognized for her leadership in the pharmaceutical industry, Leanne is also currently taking a short break from her day job because this past July, she welcomed her first son into the world. And while taking a different look or taking a step back might look a little bit different this Paralympic cycle, she definitely has her sights set on top of the podium for 2028 Paralympic Games. So please join me in welcoming the incomparable Leanne Taylor.
Thank you so much for such a warm welcome. Just getting my slides moving here. I wasn't always a member of the disabled community. In fact, when I was 25 years old, my life looked very different than it does now. I was an able-bodied athlete, competing for fun and not for anything else. I had just moved into management in the company that I worked for. I'd moved in with my boyfriend, and I was living this life that felt really quite charmed and kind of everything that I had worked for leading up to then. And in a day in July in 2018, everything for me changed. I went for a bike ride in a place that I rode very often with my boyfriend at the time, who, spoiler alert, is now my husband. And as I was riding down a hill, I made a classic cycling mistake and went over the handlebars. Something that many of us have probably done as a child and maybe a few fewer as an adult. But it wasn't an accident that looked as though it was going to be very severe. In fact, there was a physician who was biking by, and when he saw the accident, he thought the same thing. He thought, this girl's going to be fine, maybe embarrassed, but mostly fine. But as I found myself laying on the ground on the trail, I realized something. I couldn't get up. And I took a moment to take stock of what was going on in my body, and I realized that I couldn't feel or move anything from the waist down. In a weird twist of fate that I'll never quite understand, my boyfriend at the time had just finished his PhD in spinal cord injury research and graduated 2 months before I was injured. And so, having been a somewhat attentive girlfriend, I knew a thing or two about spinal cord injury. Just enough to be terrified, to be honest. I had an understanding that the sensations that I was experiencing in that moment might be permanent. And in that moment, I realized that my life might forever be changed. I was rushed to the hospital at the Health Sciences Center in Winnipeg when I found the results of my x-ray were in fact our biggest fears. I dislocated my spine at T9-10, resulting in pressure on my spinal cord that was causing the experiences that I was having. It was unlikely that I would have recovery from this injury, and I was told that early on. But I underwent a surgery that would stabilize my spine and inserting rods and screws into my back to try to protect my spinal cord and give me some chance at functional recovery. This was the first time that I took a different look at the word disabled. I was told by a poor resident who was asked to come in and tell me about my prognosis that I would be unlikely to walk again, that I would unlikely have any functional recovery, and that the sensations I was feeling from that moment that I was injured would likely last the rest of my life. If this word makes you feel a little uncomfortable, let me offer you some relief in saying that you are not alone. When I looked at this word for the first time, it didn't feel like it described me at all. And I sat as a disabled person being just as uncomfortable with this word as some of you might feel right now. And what I want to tell you, which I hope provides some relief, is that it's okay to feel a little uncomfortable with the word disabled or any of the other words surrounding it, with people who are disabled, with this idea of disability. But what isn't okay is to stay there.
We grew up in a society that is a little uncomfortable with disabilities. And we as humans are all a little uncomfortable with things that we don't know about. So if this word makes you feel a little uncomfortable today, it's okay. But where we want to try to move as a society, and what the Paralympic movement is in part trying to do, is get us to all feel a little more comfortable with this word and with the people who are described by it. And so I want to give you a little take home, a way that you can get a little more comfortable with disabilities. We are all sensitive to language in this day and age, which I think is so beautiful and so important. And so how then can we make sure that we're using words that disabled people are comfortable with? It's funny in the sport lens because we have all these correct terms that we use to describe people with disabilities. And then in reality, we often end up saying things like, is that athlete a wheelie or a walkie? So it's confusing for people from the outside to try to choose their language correctly as well. And so something that I want to give to you to use in the future is, if you're trying to choose language for someone with a disability, you can say something like, if I need to refer to your disability, what language would you like me to use? And by saying that, we can help to make sure that we're using the words that make people with disabilities feel the most comfortable. And understanding that every person's version of those words might actually be different and personal to them. So following my surgery, one of the first things that happened when I woke up is that I realized my friends and family had been sent home while the procedure was done. It was done sort of overnight. And the first thing that I did was take this picture on the right. When I look back at this picture, I always laugh because at the time I thought it was pretty cute. And it kind of made me realize that they must have given me some pretty good drugs for my surgery, because I don't think this is really my best angle. But I sent this picture to my friends and family because I wanted to set this tone for my recovery. I wanted to start off with a more positive note than where the situation had taken us. And that's easy to say in some ways, that you want to start things a little more positive. But in reality, it was much harder to do than I had imagined. When people would come and visit me in the hospital, oftentimes they would burst into tears, which was something I totally understood, because everyone has the right to have this grief as well. But it was really hard for me as a person who'd always grown up being more of a light, more of a positive influence on my friends and family. So I set this goal for myself when I was injured, and it was simply to build a life post-injury that was so good and so positive that if I was given the choice to go back and undo what had happened on that day, to become able-bodied again, to no longer be a part of this disabled community, I wouldn't take it, which at the time seemed like a really lofty goal. So what's the first thing I did when I was starting to get my life together? I realized that the arms that I had come into the hospital with were not going to be sufficient if they were going to be getting me around on a day-to-day basis. So I started in the gym. And through my physiotherapy, I overcame one of the biggest barriers that I had ever overcome. And it was actually just a 3-inch riser. So in the picture on the left, I'm sitting on top of this riser. And for days and days, I went to physiotherapy, and my challenge was to try to get from the physio bed onto the top of this riser, and it honestly felt impossible. And there were days and days that I went into the sessions and failed it and couldn't make it and struggled so much. And then when I finally did make it, someone took this picture where I'm looking back at my physiotherapist, and honestly, I look kind of smug, because I'm so thrilled with my ability to get over just this 3-inch barrier. And for me, this was really the start of something, because even though it was such a small thing to overcome, it was the first time that I realized that I could take something that was previously impossible and make it possible. And that built a lot of confidence for me. One of the things that my sister and I did early when I was in the hospital is look up what Paralympic sports exist. People had come into my hospital room and were making sort of jokes saying, maybe you'll go to the Paralympics to kind of lighten the mood and give me this possibility. So we did what every logical 25-year-old girl would do and went on Instagram to see what other athletes were doing. And we found these incredible women who were in a similar situation to me with similar disabilities who were doing triathlons. They were swimming, biking, and running, which is all things that I thought were never going to be possible for me as a wheelchair user. So I set my goal on participating in this sport. And as I participated in the sport, I started to get better at it. I started to build confidence. I started to win. And through that, I became more confident in myself as a wheelchair user. I did things that I didn't think I would do, like going back to work, like buying my first home, like building this future for myself that was going to be that much more positive than what I had originally thought. And you would think that it's the podiums and success that really is the contributor to feeling that much better. But the reality is it wasn't. It was the community. Each of the wheelchair users in these photos is a competitor of mine. And so you wouldn't think that several minutes after crossing the line of world championships, I'd be pulling them down the street to go get a coffee. But this is parasport. There's something so uniquely special about parasport in that we can go from being so fiercely competitive on the race course to then having this camaraderie that comes from our joint mission of changing the way that the world sees people with disabilities. And every one of these athletes really changed the way that I saw myself as a disabled person. So having success in sport and starting to feel like I was getting it together, I had an incredible opportunity to kind of meet what is considered the pinnacle in amateur sport, qualifying for the Paralympic Games. Preparing for the Paralympic Games is full on, and there's a lot of different aspects that go into it. But one of the most critical parts is actually the mental preparation. So we had done tons of preparation in terms of swimming in a similar kind of place that we would expect to swim in Paris 2024. We had practiced biking on cobble because we were going to be doing that in Paris 2024. We had sort of taken every different angle of preparation that we could, and what was left to do is just that mental prep. So when I thought about what I wanted to do to be in the best position to potentially podium in those games, I signed up for a race in my community. My local triathlon community has always been so immensely supportive of me as an athlete. One of the things that I did when I entered a community race is actually put a camera on my bike so that people could see what it was like to race like me. Because as I'm moving through the course on my hand cycle with my unique equipment and my unique challenges as an athlete, every single person who biked either by me, past me, I passed, had the most impressive cheer to let out, which is pretty incredible when they're biking at full speed. And so going into the games, I knew that I wanted to be around this community that got me fired up and made me feel like I was ready to represent them and to do something impressive at the games and have that best performance. But I wasn't expecting that the person who really got me most excited in that community was going to come in such a small package. This is 5-year-old Blake, and Blake has spina bifida. She had signed up for this race, and her mom had brought her from Saskatchewan to a race in Manitoba because she knew that I was going to be there. But she didn't just want to watch me race, because Blake is not like that. She wanted to challenge me to a race. This 5-year-old sweetheart wanted to challenge an athlete who was preparing to compete in the Paralympic Games to a race because she thought that she was for sure going to win. And so we set off on our race. And like I said, triathlon is swim, bike, and run. But the day that we arrived there, the waves were bigger than little Blake was. So we just went for bike and run. And we had set off on our laps on our hand cycle. We were coming into the finish line of our laps in our wheelchair. And little Blake turns around, and she's in front of me because I'm not an animal, and gives me the most fierce shoulder check I've ever seen in my entire life. Having competed in multiple international competitions in triathlon and marathon, traveling all over the world for sport, I have never seen someone so fierce and so competitive as this little 5-year-old girl who was about to beat a future Paralympian in her first triathlon race. There's something so special about the way that the disabled community shows up for each other. But I think a lot of people think that I was giving something to Blake by participating in this race. But the reality is completely opposite. Every time I think that I can't do it, every time a competitor is too fast, every time I'm worried that I'm not going to be able to make a pace time, every time I think that it's too hard, it hurts too much, I can't do it, I think of little Blake and what she would think if I was going to give up. And that's exactly what I did when I went to the Paralympics. When I raced in the Paris 2024 Paralympic Games, we had our work sort of cut out for us. It was an incredible, beautiful course. We were going to be swimming in the Seine River, the first time anyone has swam in there in hundreds of years. We were biking on the Champs-Élysées. We were finishing the race on the Alexander II Bridge here. Absolutely beautiful, iconic, incredible course. Required so much specific prep because there was current in the river, there was cobbles on the bike, there was cobbles on the run. Everything about it was incredibly beautiful and honestly incredibly difficult. And so we prepared for every eventuality of this race. There was one that I didn't prepare for, though. It was that I would show up to the start line feeling really sick. After 6 years of prep, all for this one day, it felt so terrible knowing that I didn't think I was going to have everything that I needed to have on the race course on that day. I actually had to stop to throw up on the side of the streets in Paris, sorry tourists, on the way there. And so I really wasn't feeling like I was bringing my full best self into the race on race day. And I get through the swim, I get through the bike, and I come onto the run. There's athletes that are 7 seconds and 15 seconds behind me. You can see them behind me here as we move through that final turn on the blue carpet, which is that iconic symbol of a triathlon finish. And as I'm moving down that blue carpet, I'm thinking of that one little girl, that shoulder check, that fierceness, the way that she pursued the victory no matter what. And I know that because of her and that energy that she's bringing to me, I'm going to cross the finish line in 3rd place, and I'm going to become the first female triathlete to bring home a medal from the Olympics or Paralympic Games for Canada. What does that mean? To me, it's more special than the medal itself that symbolically now in Canada, when we think of that female success in triathlon, we'll think of a wheelchair user. Special for sure that it's me, but more special that when people think of that person, that we'll think of someone with a disability. Someone with a disability that is so severe that you might actually not think that we would even be capable of doing a triathlon, let alone medaling in one. And I'm so proud of that culture change that I hope that this moment provides to allow us to see people who are wheelchair users just a little bit differently. My friends and family did not hesitate when it came to Paris 2024. There was 25 of them that showed up there wearing my face on t-shirts in a fashion that is not at all embarrassing and taking photos like this, which were taken on not a pedestrian street. They definitely shared in the moments, which I'm so happy to say that they could do, because these were the people that held my hand in the hospital and that really gave me the confidence to pursue this dream in the first place. So getting to put that bronze medal into each of their hands felt so special, and that to me, it felt like a thank you. Felt like a way of saying, I can't do much to ever thank you for all the things that you've done for me to help me to get from where I was to where I am. But I can give you this medal, and you can know that this is what I tried to do with all of the amazing things that you gave to me to support me. And that in and of itself made for so many special moments. But like a lot of athletes, when I got back from the games, things felt really different. I didn't know exactly what to do with all of the energy that I had put in. I had gone back to work at the pharmaceutical company that I'd worked for, which I loved to do, but I was sort of missing a little something in my life and kind of having that feeling of like, was it worth it? Did I sacrifice so much? Did I do so much for something that just ends and that's it? And then I got a knock on the door, and there was a little girl there who was one of our neighbors, and she had drawn this picture and she wanted to give it to me. And if I ever had questions about whether or not it was worth it, whether or not Paralympic sport was having an impact, whether or not I was doing something that was really going to be influential beyond just my own sort of pursuit of success, it was this. This little girl in my neighborhood in Oak Bluff, Manitoba, had drawn this picture of her neighbor who's a wheelchair user. And when a lot of little girls think of a wheelchair user, they might think that's something that's sad. They might think that disability is something that's sad. They might think they shouldn't ask questions, or they should be hesitant, or they should feel a little bit uncomfortable because society sometimes tells them that all of those things are true. But for this one little girl in Oak Bluff, when she drew her neighbor who was a wheelchair user, she drew a Paralympic medalist, an athlete, a strong woman who was confident, who was successful, who had her arms up in the air. And this really changed the way that I saw my journey in sport. It felt for a long time like it was about podiums and success and representing my country, and it still is. But I think the bigger picture of what the Paralympics has to offer is that we're changing the way that a little sweet girl in Manitoba draws and thinks about people with disabilities. They don't think of them as sad. They don't think of them as incapable. They think of them as Paralympic medalists, as victors, as happy, as successful, as people that they want to look up to and want to knock on their door to give them a drawing. And I think that is the most important take home for me from the games, is that we have this opportunity to change the way that people see people with disabilities. I told you in the beginning of the presentation that the goal that I had set when I was in the hospital wasn't about sport. It wasn't about going back to work. It was about something more sort of general. I'd wanted to build a life that was so positive that I wouldn't go back and undo my disability if I had the opportunity. In July of this year, I firmly solidified that I had accomplished that goal with the birth of my son, Oliver. Because if I wasn't disabled, he wouldn't be the exact little person that he is. And he wouldn't grow up knowing the strength of the disabled community. He wouldn't grow up knowing that people with amputations, people who are blind, people with wheelchair users, people with all kinds of physical impairments are not just capable of being triathletes or employees, they're capable of doing anything that they set their minds to. They're capable of being mothers, they're capable of being happy, which not everybody necessarily knows to be true. And so when I look back on my experience in the last 7 years, would I undo it? Not for a second, because disability and overcoming the challenges that it presents has made me the person that I am and shaped my family into the family that it's going to be, one where disability is not a bad word. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leanne, for sharing your remarkable story and that precious picture of baby Oliver. Too cute.
Thank you.
I want to now, take some time to just, go a little bit deeper into your story and explore your lived experience and how that's shaped who you are. But I think for folks who are listening, I think this is also about how we shape inclusion in the workplace and beyond. A lot of you, I was fiercely writing, things that you were saying that I think are such great moments and sayings that we should be thinking of. But so I have some questions, but I actually want to start with a pre-submitted question. I have to say, since starting here, this is the most amount of questions that I have received before one of these sessions. So people were really excited and I think really resonated with you. The first question came from someone and it says, as an elite athlete, you must have had many times where you had to dig deep and push through a difficult time. That might be throwing up on the side of the road, or maybe there's some other pieces. They go on to say, sometimes we glorify those moments, but the truth is that they were hard. What have you found works for you in those situations?
That's such
in
a
those
great
moments
question.
where you got to dig deep.
I think recognizing that this is the hard stuff that people talk about. So I think a lot of the time after the games, one of the questions I got asked a lot of was about the sacrifice. And at first I had a hard time answering that question because I genuinely love sport. And so a lot of the time people were like, what are the things that you've sacrificed? And I was like, well, I was 25. So I was like, I'm not going out as much, but I don't want to because I want to go to the next morning training session, or I'm not, I'm making healthier choices about food, but that actually makes me feel good. So I want to do it. So I had a hard time identifying what are the sacrifices? And I think that's actually it. It's those moments where you do have to struggle. And I think sometimes just giving it that label and saying, like, this is the hard stuff. This is what they're asking when they ask you, what's the sacrifice? What's the hard stuff? And if you know you're experiencing that and you're in one of those moments, you know you're pushing yourself and that you're doing something bigger than that moment.
Yeah, I like that framing of like naming that this is that hard moment. And I think also just knowing that there's another side to that. So I love that kind of framing. So, I hinted at it earlier, I think I'd love to actually explore, how disability can specifically shape our experiences at work. You work at a pharmaceutical company, but I think there's a lot of folks within workspaces who oftentimes don't identify their disability, specifically, especially for invisible disabilities that folks might not know about or might not feel comfortable sharing. So I think sometimes navigating those work dynamics often requires a ton of resilience, adaptability. So I think your perspective on this would be really helpful. How has your experience as a person with a disability shaped the way that you've navigated work dynamics?
There's kind of two specific moments where I really felt the impact of my disability in the workplace. The first one was when I went back to work. So I managed a sales team when I had my accident. And so when I went back to work, it was such a distinct moment of, walking into the office and then rolling into the office and standing. I'm 5'8" and now I'm 4 or something. And these little changes really felt so significant. And that was really hard for me to sort of present myself differently. And I think that expecting that was really helpful for me. I actually had a peer mentor from Spinal Cord Injury Manitoba who had gone back to work himself and said that same thing, that he was like, I'm just going to be honest, it's going to feel awkward. Like whether someone is making you feel awkward or you are making you feel awkward for a minute, that's going to feel awkward because it's so different. And then in the same way, I was working during the pandemic and I had met, like we're doing now, a lot of my coworkers or outside partners over Zoom. And so a lot of them had no idea that I was a wheelchair user. And then when we came back into office, similar thing, that I was going to have to sort of present myself and feel almost like I was walking in and being like, surprise, like you didn't know. And so I think there's some awkwardness that everyone kind of feels about that. And I think a lot of it comes down to just recognizing that we all experience that in kind of a similar way. I think there's been people that I've met on Zoom and been like, oh, you're a lot taller than I thought, or you're, like in reality, you're a little bit different than what I thought. I'm kind of realizing that we are all more alike than we are different, and we all have more similar feelings than different ones. And so everybody probably feels a little bit like that when they meet people in person for the first time. And for me, it really helped me to kind of recognize that my experiences were more human experiences than they were unique to the disabled community. And I think for people to recognize that as well, that people with disabilities, the way you treat them and react to them and their feelings are more similar to your own than they are different. And I think when we approach everybody with that kind of baseline of similarity, it helps us to not put barriers and groupings that don't really need to exist. We're all one community rather than disabled community, able-bodied community.
I really love that. And sometimes we can forget our humanity and how human and how similar we are. Do you have any other strategies that you think would be effective for just helping colleagues understand how to be more inclusive within spaces?
I think a lot of it just comes down to asking. And I hear this all the time when I hear little kids. I actually had a really funny experience. I was at a swimming pool and a little girl came up to me and she said, why do you use a wheelchair? And her mom was like, oh my gosh, stop. And then she said, how do you get in your truck? Which, I mean, I don't have a truck, so that was the answer to that. And then I was with my husband at the time and she said, is that your boyfriend? And there's something so beautiful about that line of questioning from a kid that these are the things they care about. They're kind of interested in your disability. And then they're like, anyways, what's more interesting? Do you like that guy? And I love that so much because I think that's kind of where I would love to see everybody be a little bit more like these questions. Like, do you want a cup of coffee? How can I accommodate your wheelchair? These should feel the same. Like, how can I treat you as a person? Do you need a water? And do you need me to move that chair? These should feel like the same types of questions. Like, how do I, be a good host or be a good coworker? And I think we kind of build them up sometimes to be a bigger thing and awkward in this whole thing where really just ask the question in the same way that you might ask a question to anybody else. Like, oh, would you like to take a seat? You've been standing for a while. How can I make you comfortable? I think that keeping that in mind and being more like that little girl can help us to just feel a little more comfortable with each other.
It's so true, because we sometimes can get afraid and then we don't ask the question. And when we don't ask the question, then we assume. And I think, challenge lies in that realm of assumption, whether I might say something wrong, or I might treat someone or give them treatment that they're not necessarily wanting. So that kind of simplistic of just ask. And you could find out that, like, natural curiosity might be something we use to kind of rescue our humanity. Kind of connected to that, earlier in your keynote, you talked about that word disability, and I think sometimes people are a bit careful around how they talk about disability, because the words we use really just matter, and language does kind of reinforce a barrier to help break it down. But sometimes I think the perceptions of the language, or the perceptions of getting it wrong, can sometimes inhibit people from asking those questions or even engaging. Why do you think it's so critical to be thoughtful about the language we use in shaping this kind of conversation around disability?
I think intention really shines through. And so generally, if a person kind of says an imperfect word, but in a sentence that's clearly structured to be respectful, I have a lot of forgiveness and understanding for that. And I think that same person is the person who would take the feedback if you said, totally reasonable question, I actually use this word. And I think that's kind of where we should be with it. And I think sometimes we beat ourselves up so much for not knowing something that we never learn it. And so I think that's kind of the approach that you want to take with it, is choosing the most respectful words that and acknowledging if you don't know the right one, and then asking that question of if I need to refer to your impairment, which I think you should also consider, do I need to refer to their impairment? Is it important or relevant in this conversation? But if I need to refer to your impairment, what would be the right way to do it? And I think I would have a hard time finding someone who would be offended by that. But there is a reality that sometimes people are having a bad day and you might get a reaction that isn't what you expected. But I think also having a bit of forgiveness and understanding for yourself in that situation too, that you can sometimes say all the right things and sometimes still someone feels uncomfortable or it's a little bit difficult. And so I think we always just need to kind of approach other people with curiosity, and then also with that good intention. And as people with disabilities, or anybody kind of on the receiving end of someone else is trying to navigate the right language, try to have a bit of understanding that if a person is, intending the right thing, they can only learn by asking and by you offering.
I really love that. And again, I think it comes, again, that natural curiosity, and also the assumption that sometimes we might get it wrong, and that's okay. And one of my favorite sayings is, "I'll show you grace if you show me effort." And it's this whole concept that we might not get it right, but if you show me that you actually care about what we're trying to move forward, I will be a happy participant in engaging with you. And I think there are people who are, sometimes maybe, trying to get it right, but then there are people, whether it's conscious or unconsciously, they're trying to get it wrong, or they're getting it wrong. What are kind of some of the subtle forms of ableism that you're seeing, whether it's in the professional setting, within the community setting, or even within the athletic space? How can we challenge, work together to challenge those negative thoughts?
I think one of the things that people do often, and again, I think it comes with good intention, so it's tricky, is that they won't invite someone who's disabled to something if they don't think that it's adequately accessible. So we've had friends do that. We had a friend had a baby shower, and it was hosted at, her mother's house, which wasn't accessible. And this friend didn't invite my family because she was kind of embarrassed and felt bad, and they couldn't think of a way to make it accessible. So then we weren't invited. And I think that is something that happens a lot in society, is that people with disabilities are excluded because people don't know how to accommodate them. And the reality is the world should be accessible, and that would be amazing, but sometimes it's not. And so I think that comes down to having that hard conversation with that person with a disability. I think I would have felt better if that friend had said, hey, my mom is hosting this and I don't know how to make it accessible, but I really want to. And then it invites you in. It is a challenge because it does pass some of that burden onto that disabled person. So it's not a perfect solution, but we don't live in a perfect world. And this gives that person the opportunity to then say, you know what, it's too much work, maybe I'll skip it. Or it gives them the opportunity to say, I have a workaround for that, actually. It's totally fine. And in parasport, a lot of the time, we have some wild and crazy workarounds, especially in triathlon, a sport where we're swimming in the ocean and we're cycling all over the world. We've done some weird stuff and we're comfortable with it. So I think that's kind of the question that you put then to that person, where you say, like, here's the steps I've taken to try to make it accessible. I've done my best, and maybe I can't because I can't make the beach accessible or some historic some historic site or my mom's house, but I can explain to you the situation that we're in and then give you the choice as to how you want to participate.
And I think it's like really thinking with a mindset of like, how do we build that kind of inclusive and, to use your word, accessible community? I think that's what you're saying. It's a shared responsibility. But in the roles as allies, it's not just about talking about it. It's about like, what do we actually do to kind of make an inclusive environment? So I'd love to kind of hear your thoughts about like how we can get a culture where everyone feels valued and empowered, but more specifically, like, how would you describe what an inclusive disability community looks like? And what role do you think everyone has in playing to build it?
I think when things are accessible, then we will see more participation from disabled people, and then we'll naturally think of them. And so it's kind of that spiral forward of, a lot of the time people will say, why is there so much disabled parking at the gym? Who are these disabled people going to the gym? But you don't see them if you don't make it accessible to them. They won't come there because they can't come there. And so I think a lot of the time we might put in efforts to make something accessible, and then we might think, no one used that service. Why did we do that? Or nobody asked for that, or there wasn't anybody who, say this is translated into French, maybe nobody clicked French. And so we wonder, why did we do that? But the reality is, people can't participate if we don't make it accessible and then open up the doors to people to participate in that way. So I think it's kind of a matter of, there's some great representation in parasport and gives the opportunity for people to see disabled people. But I think we should be trying to do it kind of in reverse, of thinking like, what are all the different ways that we can make this accessible so that those people do end up coming to us? Like, how can we make our workplace accessible so those people do apply? For example, websites can be made accessible to people with visual impairments, and you might think, my employer doesn't have anybody employed here with a visual impairment, so what's the point of that? Well, you don't have anyone employed there because they can't access the website, they can't find the phone number, they can't apply for the job. So making it accessible so that they can come.
Yeah, and I think it's also how we don't just hope that the community finds us. It's about being active and showing, just like you mentioned, like having the accessible parking. It's saying that we actually care and we're prioritizing your experience. I love that. So I want to go to some of these audience questions because, like I said, there was a lot of them. So I'll go to this first one. And this one, they wanted to know about this, how you avoid resilience. So how do you avoid resilience being used to justify, really challenging systems or oppressive systems? So this idea that pushing through at no matter the cost, or if you really wanted to, you could. So resilience is such a great tool that we use to kind of, rev ourselves up in those times of hardship. But sometimes it can be used on a counterpart to say, well, you should just be resilient, so get over it. How do you kind of avoid that?
Yeah, that's a really good question, how to kind of avoid that trait being sort of used against you. I think in a lot of ways, I would always say that, when you're talking about hiring someone, I don't think that we should preferentially hire people with disabilities. But what I do think is when somebody comes to an interview with a disability, there is some understanding of this challenge that it might have taken for them to get there. And you can use that as a bit of an indication of how badly they want to be there. And so I think I always say this when people ask me, why did I pursue sport after I was injured? The answer is kind of unique in that when I was injured, everything was difficult. Like putting on a pair of pants in the morning, getting out of the house, driving my car, everything was harder than it was before. And so I was really only going to do it for things that are worth it. And so when people ask me like why I started in sport, my response is that like it was worth putting on my pants to go and do a training session. And that's kind of how, I got out the door, and I liked it. It gave me enough energy that it was worth coming. And so I think that's kind of one of the ways that we can look a little bit differently on that, is not expecting that people show this resilience, but also having a little bit of respect for the motivation that it might have taken for someone to kind of overcome those barriers to get there. But it is a challenge to not sort of require that of people with disabilities, to say like, oh, because they've overcome this, like they should be tough and they should get over it. I think we want to just try to put ourselves in that situation and think like, everybody, I think, your alarm goes off and there are days when you're like, oh my gosh, I'm dragging my butt into work today. It's hard today. I think we just want to put ourselves in that situation of somebody, like, imagine we created even more barriers to a person who feels like that.
Right.
And I think when you put yourself in that situation and you feel how that feels, then the answer as to how to navigate each specific situation will become apparent to you.
So the next question is actually quite connected to this, because in this question, they're asking about how resilience sometimes can be pushing through, but sometimes it's actually about giving you permission to slow down. So they actually were interested in learning, how do you balance strength with self-care? Such a good question.
This is a really timely question for me right now, because I had my son in July of this year, so he's 4 months old. And this past weekend, I did my first postpartum competition. I did the Philadelphia Marathon. And I was super jazzed to be able to do it. And it was such an incredible experience. And then I got home and I was like, oh my gosh, this is such a next level exhausting to travel with your baby, to then do this race, to, you cross the finish line and then you're like, okay, now I have to go pump and I have to go feed this baby. And now like, it's very different from what it used to feel like when I crossed the finish line and I was like, whew, I'm done. Okay, let's go get the coffee. And so I think that I've really had to think about this more, about how do you be the right amount of tough, but how do you also keep in mind, like, why am I doing this in the first place? And I think that is kind of the answer as to how you find that right balance of self-care, is actually looking at that bigger picture and saying, like, why am I doing this? Because to me, like, doing that marathon, I wanted to do it in front of my son who's too young to care, because in the long run, I wanted him to grow up knowing that my mom pushes and that she doesn't give up and that she can have me and love me, but also be many other things. Like she can be a mom and an athlete and an employee and all these things that I wanted to show him that I, as a woman and a person with a disability, but also just a human, would be able to do. And I think that choosing then when to have love for myself just comes down to realizing like what's the big picture here is that I'm trying to show him that you can be all of the things which you simply can't do if you're not taking the time to take care of yourself so that you can be anything to anybody. So that would be my advice to someone in that situation, is just to kind of think about like, what am I doing here? What's my bigger picture? And if I was only focused on that bigger picture, then what decision would I make? And oftentimes that decision is self-care.
No, I love that. And it's kind of like balancing those two pieces, and making sure that they're in tune so that way you can show up as your best self. This question is connected to that one. This one, they specifically wanted to know, they have a preteen daughter, and their daughter is already an elite athlete in her sport. She's very passionate, disciplined, dedicated, and truly inspirational. But they understand that the road to training is hard and lonely, and it's a complete grind, especially I would say now in youth sports. It's something I have now joined, not myself as a youth, but with my kids. But how do you maintain motivation to stay the course? And I think as folks who are, I would assume this is now your Gen Alphas, who are dealing with so much more challenges and complications and distractions and social media. It's just like a different world. It was probably hard when we were doing it, but now extra hard when they're doing it. Any advice for the Blakes of the world who are coming up to stay motivated and stay the course in sport, especially for girls?
Yeah, I think there's so many distractions now. And one of the hardest things for me, I always found in sport, was comparing myself to other people and getting distracted by what that looks like. And especially with social media now, I can follow all of my competitors online and see what they're doing. And sometimes they post like a training session and I'll say like, I don't think I could do that session, or like, I'm not as fast as them, or they're spending more time on training and maybe I'm working as well, or having all these different comparisons that make you feel like you're not doing enough or you're not doing well enough. And I think that those kinds of things are distracting and discouraging and can be really hard. And if you're a youth right now participating in sport, I think we have so much information about what makes athletes good, which I didn't necessarily grow up with. Like, we weren't strength training so much when I was young, and we weren't really specific about our nutrition. We were like eating donuts and then going to practice. Like, we just didn't have so much information. And so it can be such an overload that we have access to all these things, but then we also have so many voices telling us we should do this, we should do that, we should do this. And when I had the most success in racing, it was when I started racing like myself and not like anyone else. And so that would be my advice to youth in sport right now, is to try to focus on, there's a reason, if you're child to this person who asked the question, if they've gotten this far, there's a reason why they got this far. They're good. And they got good primarily by doing, as a kid, especially by doing it their way, by, finding their own rhythm and by doing what works for them. And then I think as we grow up, we kind of get pushed into someone else's mold and it doesn't make sense. So I would encourage people just to kind of lean into, with your child, what makes them good? Is it because they love it? Is it because their best friend does it and that gets them fired up and that's why they want to show up to practice? Like, why are they there in the first place? Because there has to be a reason that they got this far, and then leaning further into that rather than leaning into what someone else is doing or why someone else is good, because it's going to be totally different.
Mm-hmm. Now, you said the word fired up, and I think the next person was really interested in understanding what got you fired up, because you've always been an athlete. And looking back at your early life, I think they wanted to know what experience shaped or influenced you to get to the path that you're in. Because even when you said, after the accident, you started to look into the Paralympics, not everybody has that as one of their first 5, 10, or even 15 thoughts. But there was something that maybe was ignited in you from maybe an early age or an experience that really drew you to sport in general. So can you think of that moment or influence that is kind of taking you to where you are today?
Yeah, when I was injured, my biggest fear actually wasn't all the things you would think it would be, like, how am I going to drive? How am I going to work? How am I going to do all these practical things? I was so afraid of the mental health aspect of it. And I was afraid of being depressed and losing that fire. And that I was afraid that because things were so much harder, maybe I wouldn't do them, or doors wouldn't be open to me in the same way that they were before, and that I would kind of lose that momentum. I was in a place where I was really content with and had worked really hard to be, and I didn't want to stop working hard. And I think that that was kind of the expectation of me, that my mom was like, oh, just, you can move home and I'll look after you. And I was like, what? No, like, I wasn't doing that before. So why would I suddenly want to do that? I'm not so different. And actually, my employer at the time came and visited me in the hospital. And one of the things he said to me was like, you'll always have a job here if that's what you want. And I remember saying that to people, and people were like, oh, that's so weird. Why would he talk about that so early in your injury? You're not focused on that. That's kind of like a tactless thing to say. But I totally felt the opposite. I was like, I actually wanted to hear someone say, like, you're still you and you're still valuable in all the same ways, and that you should still be pursuing these things. And so I think that for me, it was the desire to kind of continue to be myself and keep pursuing the next big thing. And this door opened for me, and it just made sense to go for it.
I love that. As someone who's been in sports, for a good part of my life, I'm a firm believer that sports is kind of like such a big driver, whether it's just for that self-care and that mental self-care that you talked about, but also can unite and inspire, and I think also just underpins the work that I'm in within equity and belonging. Fasken supports the Canadian Paralympic Committee, and I think it's way more than just about athletics. But sometimes people don't understand, like, why should anyone really care? Like, if I'm not an athlete, or if I'm not connected, maybe on a day-to-day aspect to sports, why should I personally care? So I guess the question more so is, why is it important? Why do you feel it's important for organizations like Fasken to support initiatives like the Canadian Paralympic Committee and its foundation?
We see changes in sport often, and then we see changes in the world. And so some places where I've really seen that for myself as an athlete, when I had my baby, I was expecting that sport was really going to change for me, because it's sort of, to me, sport is often sort of this like more dramatic version of what else is going on in the world. So maybe 10 years ago, we saw athletes who were hiding their pregnancies because they were getting dropped by sponsors, and they were getting treated differently, and their opportunities were being taken away. And there's an athlete who recently started her own running shoe company because her previous sponsor dropped her when she disclosed that she was pregnant. And in doing that, she really shook up this environment, so that for an athlete like me, maybe 10 years later, when I said that I wanted to have a child, I was told about new policies that are in place that allowed athletes to maintain the same ranking in the world ranking system while they were pregnant, so that they could come back to sport with that same ranking they left with. And obviously then you're expected, you got a race to keep it, but you're not going down in the rankings just by making that choice. And we also had changes to the way that athletes are paid on the national teams, so that they continue to be paid while they're taking a maternity leave. And those two things push that change that we see in the world. So now we're starting to see so many more athletes with children, who are pregnant, who are women just in general, even who aren't pursuing that part of their lives. And I think those changes push changes in society in general. So when we see more inclusion of people with disabilities in sport, we have that visibility, and then we see more inclusion of people with disabilities in life, which leads to such a more rich and inclusive society that has this beautiful balance between having high expectations, but then also having understanding as well.
No, so amazing. Thank you so much. I was quickly typing so many jewels that you have dropped for us. Thank you so much, Leanne, for sharing your story and your insights with us today. It's just such a powerful testament to and reminder that inclusion isn't just a value, it's a daily practice that requires action and advocacy and the courage to challenge barriers. Today, hearing from you, it just reaffirmed this commitment to creating spaces where every person can thrive and contribute and lead. Some quick ones that I heard from you. People can't participate if it's not accessible. Name the hard moment. And it's okay to, not be okay, but it's not okay to just stay there. Make the impossible possible. Set the tone for recovery. I loved that one. And my favorite, build a life so positive that you wouldn't want to go back. What a way to think about it. So thank you so much. At Fasken, our partnership with the Canadian Paralympic Committee and its foundation is a reflection of all of these values. By supporting athletes and initiatives that champion accessibility and equity, we're helping to build a future where everyone belongs on the field, in the workplace, and in our communities. This work is more important now than ever as we strive to break down barriers to foster a culture of true belonging. So as we close, I just want to remind all Fasken employees that there's still time to make a difference. Fasken will be matching any and all donations made by firm members to the Paralympic Foundation of Canada to a maximum of $20,000 until December 31st. Your support empowers athletes like Leanne, advance accessibility, and create lasting change. Thank you all so much for being a part of this important conversation. Use that QR code to let us know your thoughts. And thank you for being on this journey and this ongoing commitment to equity, diversity, inclusion. Let's continue to champion accessibility and belonging for all today and every day. Have a great day, everyone.